Have you ever asked a filmmaker why they use haze in a lot of their shots? If you have, chances are they responded with, "Oh, it's to add atmosphere," which is true, it is, but what does atmosphere even mean? Here's the deal. It's no secret that lighting is like the secret sauce when it comes to setting a mood for a scene, regardless of what you're shooting. That's undisputed. However, how effective your light is limited by how you're able to modify it. And I would argue that modification of your light is more important than just the pure output that you have at your disposal. Imagine we have a powerful spotlight shining down on a character. Is it dramatic and moody? Well, yeah, sure. But what comes to mind when you see this image? And by that I mean, what sort of story does it tell? Now let's throw in a little bit of haze. Now what comes to mind? What sort of story does this one tell over the previous one? The image on the left, the one without the haze, feels like it could be like an interrogation scene or the introduction of an antagonist or the bad guy in a story. This is due to this harsh, isolating beam of light, creating a lot of shadows on our face, a lot of contrast in general, and in addition to that, it's not a very flattering sort of light, and you see this a lot in TVs and television where the bad guy will have a light that isn't so sexy. On the flip side of that, the shot with the haze, our character almost feels a little more inviting. It feels a little more angelic because we can see that beam of light that's coming from the top of the frame. And because we can see this beam of light, it's almost as if the light itself is its own character, adding to whatever story we're telling. As you can see, it's not just about visibility or the ability to literally see your character clearly, it's about how these two characters make you feel. And this is what it means to add atmosphere to your images. This goes straight to the heart of what it means to be a filmmaker in the first place. Every decision we make, camera movement, lens choice, composition, doesn't matter what it is, it all has to complement the emotional tone or mood of the story we're trying to tell. This is so important because with haze, it's no different. Is it cool to use? Absolutely. But we want to make sure that we're using it in the right situation and not every situation. One of those right situations is when someone is sad. So here we have a character who's not having a great day, they're a little down, and they're reflecting on something, someone, some sort of memory. So we want to lean into that. And here's what we get. You can see just how much the haze added to the dream-like imagery of a memory, and so far we haven't even used an artificial light. Looking at these images side by side, there are some pretty obvious differences. The first, and one of my favorite reasons for using haze in the first place, are these beams of light coming through the window. This is a result of the sunlight hitting the haze and scattering in different directions. The sunlight coming through the window and our highlights in general are softer. We have more highlight roll-off on our subject, and our light in the entire scene is more diffused overall. All of these qualities should sound familiar because we get the same effect when shining light through diffusion fabric. As such, we can think about haze as a type of in-air diffusion for our entire scene. While this image is okay, I mean, it looks pretty cool with the beams of light coming in at the very least, let's adjust it to feel a little more like midday. We can achieve this by motivating 3 different sources of light: the sun, reflected light from the sun, and ambient light filling the room. For our sun, I took an Aputure 300D and attached an 18-inch softbox with a grid to the front. The light was then boomed overhead, just out of frame, and set to an intensity of 82%. The reflected light was an Aputure 300X with the reflector attached. It was fired into a bent acrylic mirror and aimed at the wall behind me. To get this feeling of reflected light, it was set to a slightly warmer color temperature of 4000 Kelvin, and it was at 9% intensity. For the bounce light, I simply bounced an Aputure 100XS with barn doors attached into a floppy bounce. It too was set to 4000 Kelvin and at 9% intensity. To finish the look and further control the light, I had negative fill in 4 different places throughout the room. It was located below me, near a far wall, a 4-foot floppy was near an opposing window, and a large piece of duvetine was on the floor. So far, we've used haze to achieve some pretty pronounced beams of light in our image. However, this isn't the only way or only reason to use it. In this shot, our character has hit a breaking point and is planning something sinister or evil. This look we have here does a decent job, however it's difficult to tell where our character is. There isn't any information in the back wall here because it falls completely into the shadows, so it looks like there's just a black void behind them. Once we add a thin layer of haze, the image and our feelings as an audience member completely changes. Now it feels like our character could be at a workbench in a garage that's possibly lit by an old fluorescent tube light, and this is suggested by the blooming of light that we're getting overhead. This look was achieved with a single light that's slightly backlighting our subject. In this case, I used an Aputure T4C, which is their 4-foot tube, set it to 100% intensity, 3200 Kelvin, and attached a 45-degree grid to the front. Looking at the light hitting the workbench, we can see that the light isn't as bright as it was before. Remember, haze is like a type of in-air diffusion, and because of that, it's cutting and softening our light. At the same time, the opposite effect is happening with our shadows. We now have slightly more level in all of our shadows, and the light is wrapping around my back more than it was previously. The decrease in our highlights and increase in our shadows means that we are reducing our contrast throughout the image overall, and this is just a side effect when using haze, so keep that in mind. A lowering of contrast and softer quality of light really lends itself well to that dreamlike imagery like we had in the window example. However, you don't need that harsh sunlight or just harsh light in general to get something effective. Here we have a mother and her little baby just rocking next to a window with some really soft light that's coming through. Well, not really. This is actually the light that's coming through. I knew I wanted this soft, natural window light to be extremely diffused, so I decided to go with a book light. I took a floppy bounce and put 2 pieces of 4x6 scrim gem diffusion on the opposite side. I then took an Aputure 300X and set it to 100%. In order to match the natural light coming through the window, I set it to 6500 Kelvin. Once that was set, the background needed a little more life to it, so I took a small acrylic mirror, clamped it onto the side of my bounce, and pointed it toward the back wall. I then took an Aputure 300D, brought it in really close, and set it to 20%. Now it's time for the reason you're here. Let's add in the haze. Compared to our previous examples, the image on the right, the one with the haze, isn't as dramatically different as the one on the left. Now, that doesn't mean the haze isn't doing a lot for the scene, because it is. If we look at our backgrounds with the haze, I mean, it looks hazy, for lack of better words. The highlights are softer, the shadows are more lifted, and it actually pulls our subject more forward instead of blending them into the background. Now, this book light is extremely soft, so the highlight roll-off that we have on our subject is already pretty big, but even with just a little bit of haze added, it gives it just a little more wrap around her face, but only just a little bit. And just like our background, our shadows are more lifted on her face. Now, compared to our other examples, the haze didn't transform this image into something totally new by any means, but it did add a lot of subtleties, which is really nice. These subtleties and just keeping haze subtle in general is one of my favorite ways to use it, because it's still extremely effective in pushing your mood, but it's not too forward and in your face. Now, haze may not be the end-all be-all tool by any means, but depending on the story you're trying to tell, it can be a powerful one. As always, I really appreciate you guys spending some time with me today, and I'll see you again very soon.